It was just after 3 in the morning on October 26, 1984, when two long-distance drivers on the A405 near Hagen Süd spotted a blue VW Golf in a ditch. Inside, a naked, badly injured man. He was alive when they found him, and he said, strangely, that he had been with 4 men. He died hours later. The letters YOGTZE, YOGTZE, were for decades the only word that seemed to hold this story together. This is still unanswered. I'm Mara Keller. Tonight, we walk the thin line between what can be proven and what we imagine as we try to make sense of the life and death of Gunther Stoll. Lucas, welcome back to the show. You and I have talked about how mental state and narrative can bend evidence before. This case sits right at that crossroads. For listeners who don't know you, quick intro.
Thanks, Mara. I'm Lucas Brenner, forensic psychologist at the University of Cologne. I study how perception, stress, and psychosis shape behavior, and how those states are represented in criminal narratives. And yeah, this case, it's as much about the person as about the paperwork.
Right. So tonight we'll trace the timeline, test the theories about that note YOGTZE, and unpack the recent 2025 reclassification. We'll be careful with facts, and we'll be clear where we're speculating. Let's begin at home, Anshausen, a small village in Siegerland. Lucas, set the scene. Who was Gunther Stoll?
Gunther Stoll was 34 years old, married, with a little daughter. Professionally trained as a food technician, a Lebensmitteltechniker, but at the time he was unemployed. Neighbors described him as, at least publicly, ordinary. But in the months before his death, he told his wife and a few acquaintances that he was being watched. He used the phrase die da, them, without ever naming anyone. He became restless. He said things like, "I can't take this anymore." You can imagine how that sits in a small town. Worry, puzzlement, maybe a tendency to dismiss it as stress.
His wife later said she'd grown used to his anxious, disorganized statements. But then, the night of October 25th, something else happens. He shouts, "Now I understand," writes a sequence of letters, YOGTZE, and then crosses it out. He tells his wife he's going out for a beer at the Papillon in Wilnsdorf. That's the last time she sees him. What should we make of that moment?
It's a charged moment. Someone who's been voicing persecutory ideas suddenly exclaims they've figured something out. In psychosis, that phrase, "now I understand," can mean the person has assembled a narrative that makes terrifying sense to them. It could be a real insight, it could be a delusion, or it could be a fleeting cognitive event, an epiphany that's meaningful only to him. The crossing out is interesting too. It suggests immediate doubt or regret, or perhaps he didn't want anyone else to read it.
But Mara, sorry, Lucas, I keep flipping names, Lucas, sorry. The odd detail is that the paper containing those letters was reportedly thrown away by his wife the same night, and no physical note was recovered. That single vanished scrap became a phenomenon. Why do you think that happened?
Memory, stress, and later narrative all play a role. The wife may have genuinely thrown it away in the moment because she thought it was nonsense, or because she wanted to protect the child from frightening words. Later, when the case became public, that note, real or not, acquired mythic force. Human memory is reconstructive. Later interviews can reshape how events are remembered. So the absence of the note creates an explanatory vacuum, and people fill it. Also, in small towns, people do odd things in crises, throwing away objects, burning them, hiding them. It's not evidence of deception. It's evidence of messy human behavior under stress.
Let's walk through the night. He drives to Papillon, orders a beer, and collapses off his stool before taking a sip. Witnesses said he didn't appear drunk. He said he had been gone, a blackout, and then he leaves and drives to Heigerseelbach, to an elderly acquaintance, knocks in the middle of the night, looks distressed, then leaves again. Around 3 a.m., the truckers find the car. He's naked, badly injured. What were first responders told, and why did investigators initially favor a homicide theory?
Initial medical interpretations, back in 1984, suggested injuries inconsistent with a conventional single-vehicle crash. Some experts thought he'd been run over multiple times or injured outside the car and then transported to the Autobahn. The truckers reported seeing another figure, a man in a light jacket, near the car. And Stoll's own dying statement that he'd been with 4 men who had done something to him fed a murder narrative. Remember, too, that 1980s forensics were limited compared to today. Interpretations relied heavily on intuition and subjective reading of injuries.
That line, with 4 men, it's haunting. But the case took on a public life as well. In April 1985, the TV show YOGTZE Ex Übergelost reenacted the story. The broadcast introduced the phrase YOGTZE to a national audience and turned this into an Autobahn riddle, the Bay-a-Bay-Rätsel. Suddenly, people were calling in leads. Theories spread. How does media like that affect a case's life?
Media does 2 things. It amplifies. Suddenly, the case is national news, and more witnesses or tips may come forward. It also ossifies a narrative. Once the public accepts the image of a mysterious note and possible attackers, later details tend to be read through that lens. People reinterpret ambiguous facts to fit the mystery. The YOGTZE motif became a symbol. People wanted a code to crack, a villain to unmask. That can be helpful for generating tips, but it can also misdirect investigators and the public.
Let's pause right there, because a lot of our listeners will be hanging on the note itself. We'll spend a long time on YOGTZE, because it's the case's core myth. Lucas, walk us through the main theories about that sequence of letters and which ones survive scrutiny.
Okay, Theory 1. It's YOGTZE, a Romanian radio call sign. If the G is actually a 6, radio amateurs read it as the prefix YO6, which is Romania. That drew Cold War espionage speculation. But there's no evidence Stoll was a ham operator or had contacts in Romania. It's an attractive coincidence, but weak on proof.
Another theory, often mentioned because Stoll was a food technician, is that yog might be shorthand for yogurt. TZE could be a code or suffix related to additives or flavoring. That idea paints him as a whistleblower in the food industry. Compelling, at least narratively, but
there's no evidence he was uncovering corporate wrongdoing. No documents, no whistleblower trail. It's the kind of theory you construct when you take his job title and try to retrofit meaning into a string of letters. It feels satisfying, but it lacks supporting facts.
Then there's the license plate theory and anagram theories. Someone even suggested zygote. Lucas, zygote? How seriously should we take such cryptic readings?
Not very, unless there's independent corroboration. Humans are pattern machines. We take ambiguous stimuli and bind them into meaning. Anagrams, license plates, radio call signs, they're all plausible only if you can tie them to other evidence. You don't base an investigation on wordplay. Professional cryptologists like Klaus Schmey have said there's no convincing indication YOGTZE encodes anything meaningful. The final and simplest possibility is that it was a product of a disturbed mind, a psychotic string of letters that mattered deeply to Stoll but to no one else. The final and simplest possibility is that it was a product of a disturbed mind, a psychotic string of letters that mattered deeply to Stoll but to no one else.
That last option, the idea of a psychotic word salad, is hard to present without sounding dismissive of the man who died. We need to be compassionate and also honest. Lucas, what do clinical profiles tell us? If someone starts saying they are being watched, writes strange things, and has these episodes, what might be happening neurologically or psychologically?
Compassion is key. Clinically, persecutory delusions can be a hallmark of several conditions: paranoid schizophrenia, severe depressive psychosis, substance-induced psychosis, or an acute stress reaction. Additionally, some neurological events, temporal lobe seizures, for instance, can cause altered awareness, sudden epiphanies, or transient confusional states. He collapsed at the bar before drinking. Eyewitnesses said he wasn't intoxicated. That collapse could have been a non-epileptic dissociative episode, a seizure, or a panic attack. In psychosis, the person often forms elaborate explanatory myths, to make sense of diffuse fears. Writing a code is a way to anchor that narrative. It doesn't make it meaningless to him.
In the early years, investigators leaned toward homicide because of the injury patterns and the suggestion he'd been run over. That story persists in popular imagination. Fast forward to 2025. Hagen police reopen the technical review, order new expert reports, and conclude, after more than 40 years, that this was a single-vehicle accident. They cite injury patterns consistent with a solo rollover, no foreign DNA in the vehicle, and crash reconstruction that fits driver error or impairment. Lucas, do you find this reversal convincing?
From a scientific standpoint, yes. Forensics has advanced dramatically since the 1980s. Modern trauma analysis, paired with DNA techniques, can give more reliable answers. The absence of foreign DNA and the new reading of injury patterns weakens the run-over theory. Crash reconstruction is powerful. Specific patterns of skeletal injury and vehicle deformation tell a story. If the latest expert report, released in 2025, finds the injuries align with a single crash, that's evidence we must take seriously.
But the public reaction was predictably mixed. Some welcomed the closure. Others felt cheated. They had invested in a murder narrative for decades. Why do you think people resist an accidental explanation?
Because murder gives the story an external agency, a culprit. It's narrative satisfying. Accidents are messier, harder to moralize. Also, there's the phenomenon of apophenia, our desire to find connections. When you've built a myth around a clue like YOGTZE, it's hard to accept that the clue might be the product of a distressed mind, and that the death, though tragic, was not the result of a conspiracy. People dislike anticlimax.
We should be clear with listeners. The 2025 decision rests on new expert reports and the lack of exogenous DNA evidence. Investigators publicly stated they no longer believe there's proof of other people at the scene. Prosecutor Gerhard Pauli said the evidence points to a single car accident. Police spokesman Tino Schaefer echoed that. So, officially, not homicide, closed as accident. But, Lucas, what about the elements that still make the story eerie? The nakedness, the apparent confusion, the midnight knocks on a stranger's door. Those are haunting human details that science can't fully explain.
Exactly. The facts can tell us the mechanics of death, the path of the car, the likely cause. But they can't reconstruct the inner life. Why he wrote that note, why he stripped, why he went to the elderly woman's house. Those are psychological and existential questions. A psychotic episode can explain some behaviors. Disrobing is associated with delirium, with the sensation of heat or insects on the skin, with a need to get away from perceived contamination. But unless someone left a clear record, diary, letters, witnesses who understand his inner logic, those choices remain, well, still unanswered.
Still unanswered. That's our show's name for a reason. I want to press you on one detail. The truckers said they saw possibly a man in a light jacket near the car. How reliable are such late-night eyewitness accounts? Could that have been a trick of perception?
Nighttime is a terrible environment for reliable perception. Objects are seen peripherally. Shadows produce false contours. Stress amplifies suggestion. A trucker approaching a crashed car at 3 a.m., adrenaline, low light, could misinterpret a tree stump, a reflection, or even their own door silhouette as a person. Eyewitness testimony is far less reliable than people imagine, especially under poor conditions.
That's important. We humans trust seeing, but sight betrays us. Now, let's talk about how the internet took YOGTZE and spun it into a legend. From creepypasta to Reddit threads to horror videos, this case bloomed into global myth. Lucas, what harms or benefits come from that kind of online myth-making?
Benefits. It keeps attention on cold cases, sometimes generates leads, and creates a community of people interested in solving puzzles. Harms. It often detaches the real person from the story. The victim becomes a cipher, a remote protagonist in someone else's horror. It encourages embellishment, leads to conspiracy thinking, and can re-traumatize families. In the YOGTZE case, the Internet narrative often elevated speculation over evidence, making it emotionally harder to accept the 2025 reclassification for people invested in the murder theory.
We owe it to the deceased to avoid turning him into a ghost story. That said, part of our job is to follow every thread. Let's take some of the more exotic theories. Espionage during the Cold War, for instance. The YOGTZE reading lends itself to that. How plausible is an espionage angle?
Not very. In the absence of corroborating facts, 1984 was Cold War Europe. People were sensitive to anything that smacked of cross-border intrigue. But no records tie Stoll to intelligence, smuggling, or radio operations. Again, it's the human tendency to connect dots that may not belong to the same constellation. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We don't have it here.
Okay, let's shift. There's an uncomfortable possibility some of our listeners might prefer we skip over, the role that stigma plays when a victim probably suffered a mental health crisis. People often react with anger, as if suggesting psychosis is a way of blaming the dead. How do we responsibly talk about that?
With care. Suggesting that someone had a mental health condition is not blaming them. It's recognizing that the human brain can sometimes produce perceptions and behaviors that are not under conscious control. Compassionate language matters. We should say that Stoll may have been in severe psychological distress, rather than implying fault or moral failing. Understanding mental illness can humanize, not dehumanize.
Good. We'll be careful. Now, listeners will ask, if the note might not have existed, how did it become the name of the case? The YOGTZE label took over early on. Why did investigators and the public seize on it so quickly?
Because a single enigmatic object is easy to hold on to. It's emblematic. Investigatively, it offered a lead. something to share with the public that might provoke recognition. For journalists and TV producers, it made for a hook. Once it became the public's hook, the label stuck. The fact that the paper disappeared only increased its allure. Mysteries sell.
And sell they did. But let's return to the technical review. The 2025 experts tested for DNA and concluded no other person's DNA was found in the vehicle. They reinterpreted injuries and concluded the pattern fits a rollover. Follow-up question: could traces have been lost, destroyed, contaminated over 40 years? Is it possible that people were there but left no DNA?
Contamination and loss are theoretically possible, yes, but modern forensic techniques can detect minute traces. If the police re-examined retained evidence and found nothing, especially in an era when contamination would more likely introduce extraneous DNA rather than erase it, that's persuasive. You can't logically continue to insist multiple attackers were present when the only physical evidence is consistent with a solo accident. Absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, but here the experts are careful. They don't just say we found no DNA, they read the injury patterns and crash dynamics too. The converging lines point in the same direction.
Convergence matters. We need to balance the human hunger for villainy with the weight of modern expert analysis. Still, emotionally, people will wonder why he ended up naked. Do you have theories that feel most plausible, given the material?
Several plausible explanations. 1. He could have been in a state of delirium or psychosis that caused him to strip before driving. 2. Clothes could have been torn or displaced during a severe crash, though that is less likely to result in total nudity. 3. Hypothermia or drunkenness sometimes lead to undressing, but witnesses said he didn't appear drunk. 4. He may have removed clothing to deal with an itch or the sensation of overheating, again, a symptom sometimes reported in psychosis or certain metabolic states. We can't be certain, but the psychosis-linked explanations are plausible and fit other behaviors. The late-night wandering, the collapse at the bar.
Let's bring this together. For our listeners, we'll lay out 3 competing narratives. First, murder, the conspiracy theory. Second, a psychological crisis leading to an accident, the official 2025 position. Third, a hybrid, some real external threat amplified by Stoll's instability. Lucas, summarize the strengths and weaknesses of each.
Narrative 1, murder. Strengths: Stoll's reports of being watched, his claim about being with 4 men, and early forensic readings suggesting injuries incompatible with a simple crash. Weaknesses: lack of DNA, no identified suspects, reinterpretation of injuries by modern experts. Narrative 2, psychological crisis leading to accident. Strengths: corroborated by months of reported paranoia, the collapse at the bar, the late-night wandering, and modern forensic convergence. Weaknesses: emotionally unsatisfying and cannot fully explain some physical anomalies like nudity without speculation. Narrative 3, middle ground. Strengths: recognizes that human situations are messy. Maybe he was threatened earlier or had conflicts that fed his paranoia, even if they didn't directly cause his death. Weaknesses: remains speculative and doesn't provide hard evidence of any external actor involved in the fatal moment.
So, what are the real unanswered questions then? Even with the 2025 closure, what do we not know?
We don't know what YOGTZE meant to him. We don't know precisely why he stripped. We don't know what happened in the minutes between the Papillon and the Autobahn. We don't know whether his reports of being watched were founded in specific incidents or were primarily internal experiences. Those are subjective, psychological mysteries that forensics can't, by itself, resolve.
And we don't know, probably will never know, what that last hour felt like for him. That's the human center of the case. Before we close, I want to ask you a practical question. As a forensic psychologist, what would you advise investigators doing a cold case reassessment like the one in 2025? What should they keep in mind beyond DNA and crash reconstruction?
Listen to the human context. Re-interview family with sensitivity. Examine medical and psychiatric records. Look for patterns of behavior, like repeated calls to doctors or notes. Consider neurological causes, EEG records, seizure histories, even if no prior diagnosis exists. And be cautious about letting public myth guide investigative priorities. Approach the case with multidisciplinary teams, trauma surgeons, forensic pathologists, neurologists, psychologists. Evidence is cumulative. The human story matters, but it must be weighed against material facts.
That's useful. Listeners, we'll place a full list of sources in the episode notes. The 1985 Aktenzeichen piece, Stan Crime's Deep Dive, Wikipedia summaries, and the 2025 coverage by regional press that announced the reclassification. Now, let's take a breath. Lucas, 2 short human questions before we go. 1. If you could say one careful sentence to the family of Gunther Stoll, his wife, his daughter, what would you say?
I would say, I'm sorry for your loss, and I hope you are given space to grieve without the burden of other people's myths. Whether he was the victim of others or of an illness, the tragedy of his death is real and deserving of compassion.
Beautifully put. Final question, one that our listeners always ask. Do you, personally, think this was an accident?
Based on the convergence of modern forensic analysis, the lack of exogenous DNA, and the documented psychological symptoms, I find the single-vehicle accident explanation the most scientifically persuasive. But persuasive is not the same as definitive. Some color remains outside the lines.
We'll end where we started, with an image. 2 truckers on a motorway, a blue VW in a ditch, a man who said he'd been with 4 men, and a sequence of letters that may have been meaningful only to him. The official record now calls it an accident, but the human fragments, shouts at a kitchen table, a collapsed man at a bar, a midnight knock, remain. They're pieces we can't lock into a neat box. Lucas, thank you for joining me, for your caution, your empathy, and your clear explanations.
Thank you, Mara. It's been important to talk about how science and story intersect, especially when the subject is a real life and a real death.
For anyone who is new to Still Unanswered, we try to separate the verified record from rumor. We try to be honest when evidence points one way and when it leaves us guessing. If you're interested in reading more, check the episode notes for primary sources. If you have memories or local knowledge about the case, be mindful. Investigators have closed the file officially. But if you think you can add relevant evidence that was overlooked, contact the Hagen police. Otherwise, hold your theories like fragile things. Tonight, we remember Gunther Stoll as a father, a husband, a man who walked out into a night we can't fully understand. Good night.
Good night.